Well, welcome to our panel on genius, celebrity, and the self. We're being recorded as an H. France Salon, so when we get to the question and answer period, I'll be asking people to identify themselves before making their interventions. Our panel includes Anthony VOPA, Antoine LILTI, Darrin and Sophie ROSENFELD. I am its chair. My name is Kathleen KETE. I was asked to join this session since I've recently engaged with some of the themes of the panel in my book, Making Way for Genius, The Aspiring Self in France, From the Old Regime to the New, which was published by Yale in 2012. I'll be interested to see how that discussion has moved forward since I first imagined that project. That genius should have intrigued contemporaries comes as no surprise, since it spoke to questions of Enlightenment culture. On the one hand, it's a question of liberty. How should the unfolding of self, which is genius, be treated by conventional society, which became the Romantics' way of posing the problem of genius? On the other hand, Making Way for Genius explained, genius raises the question of equality. How should each of us relate to each other within our society, despite our natural differences? How does universality, all human beings born free and equal in their rights, relate to originality? Moreover, if we are all alike, as the materialist claimed, how do we explain one person's success and another's failure? How does one explain one's own failures? How does one weigh one's own success? What are the ethical costs of celebrity? These are questions of historical importance with no little resonance today. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker, Anthony VOPA, I did it wrong, Darrin from Florida State University, whose earlier works include Enemies of the Enlightenment, The French Counter-Enlightenment and the Making of Modernity, Happiness, a History, and most recently, Divine Fury, A History of Genius. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathleen. I don't really want to tell the brave souls gathered here that this is going to be taped and broadcast because you might all leave. It's a heroic effort for you to be here on a Sunday morning. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to speak about genius and kind of one aspect of it that relates to my book, Divine Fury, and it's a tension between the emergence of genius and geniuses and equality. Alexis de Tocqueville, louder? Yeah. Alexis de Tocqueville, as all of you are no doubt aware, was an analyst of liberty and equality. But it also turns out that he was an analyst of genius, a subject he writes about sporadically but with characteristic insight in several places in Democracy in America, particularly in Volume 2, where he notes that, quote, when there are no more hereditary riches, privileges of rank, and prerogatives of birth, it becomes clear that what makes the principal difference among the fortunes of men is intelligence. In Tocqueville's view, intelligence, and elsewhere he says genius, and those terms are not by any means synonymous at this point, although they're coming to be seen as synonymous. In Tocqueville's view, intelligence, genius, becomes an essential criterion of social distinction, the basis for a new kind of hierarchy in societies like the United States and France that were contesting older aristocratic notions or forms of superordinate authority. This is a subject that John Carson has explored in the cases of France and the United States in his excellent study, The Measure of Merit, Talents, Intelligence, and Inequality in the French and American Republics. And I would argue that a certain rhetoric of genius serves as well as what John calls a shadow language of inequality that accompanies the proclamation of universal equality from the start. It followed from Tocqueville's analysis that genius and geniuses were necessarily in a certain tension with democracy and equality. And indeed, he argued that in the case of the United States, the two were fighting a kind of extended battle, with, quote, genius becoming rare as enlightenment becomes more common. What in aristocratic societies had once been concentrated in exceptional individuals would gradually be divided equally among all, as the spread of learning expanded creative and intellectual capital with enormous productive potential. In the American Republic, where, quote, scientific and literary genius was as rare as ability is common, this process was already underway. Long before the latest avatars of collective intelligence or the wisdom of crowds, Tocqueville was suggesting that in the end, many heads would prove better than one. I only came to Tocqueville in this connection quite late in the process of researching and writing Divine Fury, A History of Genius. But it crystallized for me a number of themes I'd been grappling with for some time. The tension between the extraordinary cult of the genius that emerged in the 18th century and the simultaneous and I think somewhat paradoxical emergence of a discourse of human equality, as well as the uneasy relationship between genius and liberty, and the talk of genius as a kind of privileged being or moral exception in the social imaginaries of modern societies. What I try to show in the book, and here my work dovetails not only with that of John Carson, but as well as the French sociologist and colleague of Antoine LILTI, Nathalie Hennig, is that the genius figure comes to be seen in tension with equality, imagined either as a kind of antidote or corrective to equality, or for others as a problem or a threat to equality, but also as a kind of privileged being, for better and for worse, who can claim to break and make laws that ordinary men and women in liberal societies must simply follow. The genius, in other words, becomes a kind of positive version of what Uday Mehta has called liberal exclusions, right? Women, people of color, Jews, those groups who were excluded from or denied the universal rights proclaimed in the 18th century on the spurious scientific and anthropological grounds that they were somehow unfit and so undeserving of the equal treatment accorded to others. The genius, too, I want to suggest, is treated as an exception, one very often justified on the basis of the very same spurious science that would place women and people of color so many standard deviations from the norm on one side of the scale of cranial capacity, of brain size, intelligence, all used as metrics of genius in the 19th and early 20th centuries, with genius then on the other side of the scale. Geniuses, as Francis Galton would declare in his 1869 Hereditary Genius, a work that protests in, quote, the most unqualified manner against the pretensions to natural equality. Geniuses, for Galton, appeared on Earth statistically at the rate of 1 in 10 million. And so were conceived. He has various figures, but that's the one he wants to stick to. And so were conceived as, quote, grand human animals of nature's preeminently noble, born to be kings of men. Whereas the liberal exclusions were denied rights, geniuses amassed privileges. Everything is permitted to genius, as the criminologist and student of genius Cesare Lombroso observed characteristically in his important study of 1889, L'uomo di genio, the man of genius. So the tensions I'm describing, the tensions between a discourse of genius and a discourse of equality, the question of the genius's rightful place in liberal democratic societies, the relationship between genius and freedom, genius and license, are perfectly evident by the second half of the 19th century. And I try to give lots of examples of this in my book. But what I want to suggest today is that these tensions are already evident in the 18th century, and that they get played out in Republican debates in the French Revolution. The cult of genius emerges in the 18th century for a number of reasons. It's a complex phenomenon and multi-causal. And those reasons certainly include a performative dynamic that people like Foucault or Norbert Elias in his wonderful little posthumously published book Mozart, Kathleen herself or Tony is in the process of doing, I think would draw attention to in the context of the invention of the writer, the artist, and the genius. But I think there are other things going on as well. And really, the central contention of my book is that there is a religious dynamic at play. with a genius figure moving into a conceptual space long occupied by a host of higher beings, angels, prophets, apostles, saints, long thought to mediate between ordinary humanity and the divine. Geniuses, as scholars like Patricia Farah have appreciated, become something like secular saints in the 18th century. And the magical or religious powers attributed to them get further elaborated in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, when scholars, particularly in Germany, begin to speak openly of what the Austrian critic Edgar Zissel called, in a book of that name published in 1918, Die Genie Religion, the genius religion. So that's sort of one dynamic in play, this religious dynamic and the way in which geniuses come to assume some of the role of religious figures of old. But there's also in the 18th century an engagement with the question of equality and the proposition or the self-evident truth that all, or at least all men, are created equal. And Jefferson, we know, didn't really believe that. Didn't believe in either the strong form of equality that would imply that human beings have been given equal natural endowments, that they're literally created equal in their capacities, though there are people in the 18th century ready to defend that claim. Nor did Jefferson believe in the weaker claim, but still powerful form that would imply that regardless of how we are created, smart or dumb, weak or strong, gifted or otherwise, we ought to be afforded equal rights and to be treated equally before the law. Jefferson and many other contemporaries, of course, factored out all kinds of exceptions or exclusions to universal equality, but he also made an exception for the specially endowed, those he and others of the age described as a natural aristocracy. In Jefferson's parlance, a natural aristocracy as opposed to the tinsel or artificial aristocracy of wealth and birth. Men whose inherent superiority of talent, of intelligence, virtue, and merit, or as Jefferson puts it elsewhere in a famous letter to John Adams, worth and genius, men of worth and genius, these capacities ought to set them apart from the crowd, marking them out for a special place in modern societies. They are the ones who should lead, providing a more legitimate way, in Jefferson's view, to arrange the social hierarchy. And this term, natural aristocrat, has an interesting history in Republican discourse. It goes all the way back to James Harrington in the Commonwealth of Oceana. But Adams, Thomas Paine, and many others in the 18th century employ it. So Jefferson is giving voice not only to a broader anxiety about the consequences of a new kind of equality and the displacement of an older form of social hierarchy, but also registering, at least on some level, the place of genius in debates about how the social order ought to be arranged going forward. And yet, for various reasons, and Tocqueville himself addresses some of these as well, there's far greater ambivalence about the cult of genius in America than in Europe, where there's at once a much older tradition of thinking about natural inequality, but also at the same time, at least at the time of the French Revolution, a more radical insistence on human equality in its various forms. And that makes, I think, for a more heated and central discussion around genius in the European case. So the first thing I would flag is genius's connection to liberty. And there's in fact a British and a French discourse from the early 18th century forward that placed genius in close alliance with liberty. Whig defenders of the Glorious Revolution, for example, were fond of quoting Longinus, whose recovered treatise on the sublime was important in the context of 18th century discussions of genius, arguing that, quote, democracy is the nursemaid of genius, and that freedom alone has the power to foster noble minds. Many during the French Revolution concurred. Nature has formed an intimate union between liberty and genius. The playwright, poet, and politician Marie-Joseph Chénier emphasized in a 1796 report recommending the transfer of Descartes' remains to the Pantheon, which is an interesting episode in itself. Charging, Chénier did, the old regime with a, quote, crime against genius for not granting the great philosopher the liberty his genius demanded and deserved. In Chénier's view, and by 1796 it had been articulated many times, genius must be free, and when it was not, it would bridle at established laws. The genius, after all, was a necessary and natural revolutionary. As the Marquis de Condorcet emphasized in his own attempt in 1791 to secure a place for Descartes in the Pantheon, Descartes, quote, brought philosophy back to reason, liberating the human mind, while at the same time preparing the eternal destruction of political oppression. He was, as Condorcet's friend D'Alembert declared, among the small number of great geniuses whose works have spread enlightenment among men. There was implicit in all this a kind of great man theory of history, a theory that we tend to associate with the 19th century and people less enlightened than Condorcet or D'Alembert, and yet it was there very early, in Enlightenment discourse, in Republican discourse, in revolutionary discourse. As early as the 1760s, for example, Chamfort was observing that, quote, the genius of a few great masters of humanity shaped the spirit of the age, imposing its sovereignty on the mass of men. And although that was, of course, a myth and a pose and a fantasy, the revolutionaries' effort to ground their own actions in the preliminary work of a few great masters of humanity, people like Descartes, or Voltaire, Rousseau, Franklin, Mirabeau, these efforts only reaffirmed that myth. In a country whose people stormed the Bastille en masse and marched to Versailles to remove the king and queen, the many could still revere the extraordinary individual. The many could still revere the one. How fitting then that genius should take the place of kings on revolutionary playing cards, that genius and the génie de la France graced revolutionary coins, just as the genius of the emperors had once sealed the specie of Rome. Symbolically, at least, genius was usurping the place of sovereigns and claiming the rights of kings. But was that not unseemly in a republican regime? Unseemly in the mouths of those who spoke not only of liberty, but also of fraternity and equality. The Dantoniste Fabre d'Églantine didn't think so. Just as early revolutionary almanacs replaced the saints of the liturgical year with universal figures, such as Leonardo, Descartes, Racine, Molière, and Voltaire, so in 1793, when the revolutionaries abolished the Christian calendar, did they vow to devote a day at the end of the revolutionary year to a fête du génie, a festival of the genius, and it's Fabre who proclaims this in the convention. As Fabre explained in submitting the proposal to the convention, the festival of the genius would honor, quote, the most precious and lofty attribute of humanity, intelligence, which sets us apart from the rest of the creation. And though Fabre didn't say it outright, one might have added that sets us apart from one another. Fabre's emotion in the end passed, though not without debate. And the debate is interesting, I think, for the tension it reveals. Claude Bazire, who sat with the Mountain, rose in the National Convention to warn of the dangers of the aristocracy of the genius. Robespierre was even more pointed. A festival virtue should take precedence over the day of genius, he insisted. Caesar was a man of genius, but Caesar was nothing but a tyrant. Cato, by contrast, possessed virtue, and Cato was of far greater worth than Caesar. Similarly, Robespierre maintained the author of Brutus had genius, but Brutus the man was worth more than Voltaire. Robespierre's point was that Republicans should insist on ideals that could be cultivated and instilled, and honor the heroes that embodied them, rather than laud what could hardly be changed. For genius, Robespierre admitted, was born, not made. That was, as it happens, a thoroughly Rousseauian position. In fact, Rousseau makes perfectly clear in his discourse on the origins of inequality and elsewhere where he speaks specifically about genius, that there were two types of inequality. There was political inequality, but there was also natural inequality. And while the first, in the state of nature, didn't amount to a whole lot, natural equality, differences in bodily strength and qualities of the mind or soul, served in society as the lever of social distinction and so of growing political inequality. It therefore became incumbent upon wise legislators, as a consequence, and of course good Republicans, to do everything possible to mitigate and contain natural distinctions. There was, however, a different position, a different way at the question, which departed from a strikingly different premise. It was the premise of Thomas Hobbes. It was the premise of Helvetius. Both men, for however different reasons, had argued for a natural human equality in the faculties of the mind. Hobbes in Leviathan, in Book 1, Chapter 13, and Helvetius in De l'Esprit, where he argued on the basis of an extreme Lockean and Condillacian associationism that, quote, genius is not the gift of nature, but rather the product of exposure and training and opportunity. This was, in effect, an early articulation of what my colleague, the psychologist Anders Ericsson, calls deliberate practice. It's what Malcolm Gladwell has popularized on the basis of Anders' work as the so-called 10,000-hour rule, right? The idea that people like Mozart and the Beatles get good at things not because of inherent genius or talent or superiority, but rather through long practice and early exposure. Human beings, for Helvetius similarly, were not only deserving of equal rights, they were naturally or inherently equal in their faculties and mental endowments. That claim, and others made it in the 18th century, brought forth a visceral reaction. It provoked Voltaire, and it provoked Diderot, who reasserts, as I think Tony will tell us in more detail, in his Réfutation de Helvetius of 1774, what will emerge from the 18th century as the dominant position on genius. That genius is born, not made, that it can't be acquired or learned, and that it always is exceedingly rare. People like Helvetius want to claim that genius is a function of exposure and practice, and they base this on this Lockean epistemology. But what I argue, and I think is really the case, by the end of the 18th century, the contrasting position that genius is natural and inherent has really won out in European debates, and that continues to be the way people talk about genius in the 19th and 20th centuries. You either have it or you don't, okay? Even, to be sure, if you have it, you have to work at it. And nonetheless, genius is something that is inherent, that is given. On compte sur les doigts les hommes de génie, Diderot claims in lambasting Helvetius. Dans l'ordre éternel, le monstre appelé homme de génie soit toujours infiniment rare. And here I think you do see a reaction or reserve to the assertion of human equality. You certainly see it in the Revolution, in debates about education, most directly, and Condorcet is one interesting example, I think, of many. He is, of course, among other things, an important theorist of education, and in many ways he's close to Helvetius on questions of genius and intelligence. And yet he can't quite shake the belief, as he puts it in his essay of 1791, The Nature and Purpose of Public Instruction, that, quote, all individuals are not born with equal capacities. For Condorcet, there was in fact a natural aristocracy, and men and indeed in Condorcet's understanding women as well, of genius were at its apex. And it was this group of what he calls a limited number of exceptionally enlightened men that drove history and the progress of the human mind. In many ways, Condorcet wished it were otherwise. And in fact, his educational system, like his politics, was designed to cull genius from all levels of society. Right? Geniuses were rare, but they might come from anywhere. Jefferson described this in his own plan for expanding public education in the state of Virginia as, quote, searching for geniuses raked among the rubbish. But a just social and political order ought to work not simply to discover genius wherever it might appear, but also, and at the same time, to minimize natural differences by expanding opportunity and removing unfair advantages with the goal of raising the general level. The point, though, is that even for someone like Condorcet, who is, of course, far from seeing equality as an undesirable goal, the effort to cultivate it poses problems for which genius is, in some sense, the obstacle as well as the solution. Now, I realize that I'm running short on time, but let me just close by invoking one other possibility, one other political possibility of genius, and that is that rather than working to control and contain and channel genius within the context of an expanding equality, one could empower it, right? Raise it aloft and then genuflect before it. This was, in fact, the specter of Robespierre when he invoked the genius of Caesar, the genius as tyrant. Or for someone like Joseph de Maistre, the génie infernal de Robespierre served exactly the same ends. It was also, in certain respects, the specter of Diderot. For his monster named genius, this anomaly and aberration, he believed, could not always be trusted to respect the liberty of others or to cultivate fraternité. The genius also had a penchant for destruction, repression, and crime, as you'll know if you've read The Nephew of Rameau. If I knew history, Rameau's nephew declared amidst a long discussion of the theme, I would show you that evil always arrives on earth by means of some man of genius. A reader of the first published version of Rameau's Nephew, published in 1805 in German translation by Goethe, might have thought of Napoleon as an illustration of that claim. But in any case, Napoleon undoubtedly turned the 18th century's cult of genius to his advantage. It was part of his genius, in effect, to appreciate the political possibilities of genius and to use it quite self-consciously in a way that I don't think historians have fully appreciated, quite self-consciously and effectively in his propaganda to justify, to give legitimacy and sanction to a rule that was based not, of course, on divine right or on democratic mandate or natural selection or natural equality, but on the claim and basis of difference, fundamental, constitutional, inherent difference. As Napoleon himself claimed, and there's no shortage of faithful subjects granted both at the time and to this day, Napoleon was a genius, and genius by its very nature conferred special privileges and rights. The right to rule over others, the right to send legions to their grave. In the master morality of genius, everything, as Lombroso declared, is permitted. Thank you.